Good evening, everyone. Ms. Taylor, thank you for the invitation and this opportunity to participate in this incredibly forward-thinking event, the Black Album Mixtape. Also, thank you to your fantastic support team. Also, my appreciation to Southern Methodist University for its sponsorship of this event. You know, in the wake of the most recent history of extrajudicial murders of Mr. George Floyd, Ms. Breonna Taylor, and the murder of Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, this evening we will examine what does it mean to be African American in 2021. Now, this is a very interesting and relevant question for us to discuss, and it can be discussed from a number of different angles and perspectives. The first can be from the perspective of, or through the long historical lens of the dominating culture. Another perspective can be from our own. If we start the discussion or analysis from the perspective of the dominating culture, we can start in 1619 when the first 20 and some odd Africans who were classified by their European captors as indentured servants disembarked from that Dutch man of war at Port Comfort, Virginia, near Hampton. Through our lens, they were enslaved Africans. In 1662, the issue was, in the context of the dominating culture, as they wrote it, the status of children, as they expressed it, got by Englishmen upon a Negro woman, is the child slave or free? Through our lens, the issue was, what was the status of children born as the result of the rape of African women in America by European men? Their answer, per the laws of Virginia, Act 12 from 1662, quote, be it therefore enacted, all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, end quote. That was their determination of our fate. Nat Turner and others, viewing themselves through a different lens, did not accept that dictate and gave their lives for our ongoing struggle for freedom. If we view ourselves through the founding documents of this country, the US Constitution, for example, the perspective of the dominating culture describes us as 3/5 of a person. There's, of course, the Fugitive Slave Clause and the fact that the United States Constitution allowed for the importation of enslaved Africans for 20 years until January 1st, 1808. In the terms of our status or classification as enslaved or free via the lens of the Supreme Court, according to the Dred Scott case of 1857, the US Supreme Court held in a 7-2 decision with Chief Justice Roger Taney issuing his infamous decision stating in part, quote, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the US and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court, and that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States. Negroes are considered an inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and has not rights or privileges that whites are bound to respect, end quote. These are just a few historic examples of how the dominating culture has described us, codified us in law as things, chattel, personal possessions, items of property other than real estate. Du Bois said, quote, many people have suffered, but none of them were real estate, end quote. The late great Amiri Baraka said to me directly, oh, slavery in America is not even about getting your butt beat. It's about them transforming you into a thing which they can dispatch the way they want to. No matter what you do, even today, it's that thingness that's maintained. So with that said, our guest speaker and I have decided to answer the question, what does it mean to be African American in 2021? But from what perspective? Do we fall into the easy trap of the negative European American cultural stereotypes that focus on our thingness and our failures, or do we, as Ralph Ellison wrote, reveal our human complexities that are far beyond what those stereotypes are intended to conceal and focus on the positive, self-affirming reality that is our own? Well, we choose the latter. So allow me now to bring in our featured speaker. I believe, to me, one of her greatest accomplishments is that she's a regular guest on my radio program, Inside the Issues. It's always an honor. Ms. Ruby Nail Sales, good evening, Ms. Ruby, and welcome.
Good evening, and I'd also like to echo my thanks to Ms. Regina Taylor and to all of the people who worked hard to bring into being this conversation. And a special thanks to you also, Wilmer, for inviting me to be your guest.
It's an honor as always. So with the question, what does it mean to be African American in 2021? We can do this analysis from the perspective of or through the long historical lens of the dominating culture, but why is it so important for us to do this analysis from our own historical perspective?
Well, first of all, it's really important for us to ask the question that Ralph Ellison asked. Are we simply what white people make of us? Or are we also what we make of ourselves? And it is important for us to understand that we also, as our ancestors reminded us during enslavement, that we were more than what they made of us. We did not begin, they would say that we began this journey as enslaved people, when in fact we began the journey as free people who were captured and who were enslaved and who were taken away from our lands and brought to a foreign country, where by the waters of Babylon, where we wept when we remembered Zion, where the wicked carried us away captivity and required of us a song. And the question, as the psalmist asked, how do we sing our sacred song in a strange land? And we sang our sacred songs in a strange land by making something magnificent out of the arid soils of oppression and creating one of the most incredible stories, not only of Black survival, but Black accomplishments. And it's really important for us to see ourselves beyond suffering, because if we are just suffering, we're victims, but we're also victors and the makers and the shapers of history. That is as important to understand as it is to understand the ways in which we were victims of white violence and oppression.
So as you and I have discussed this over time, and I know Ms. Taylor wanted this to be an intergenerational discussion. About a month ago or so, I was listening to an interview with the late Ms. Cicely Tyson, and she was discussing her time as an activist. And one of the things that she mentioned and lamented was the problem she had getting younger generations to truly appreciate the struggle. She said that because so many kids today have gone to integrated schools, as have many of their parents, they did not see color only or white only signs, and they can go to restaurants, they can pretty much do what they want to do. They can't believe beyond their very limited realities. Your thoughts on that, and that to me takes us into the discussion of what does it mean to be an African American in 2021?
That is certainly true, that there was a deliberate attempt, especially in the South, given the power and the victory of the Southern Freedom Movement, that we reduced to a civil rights movement. I think it's very important at this point to understand that it was a freedom movement. It was not merely about civil rights. It was about the right to move around in society without being hunted down and killed. It was the right to live into our full capacity as human beings. It was the right to be paid a living wage for our labor. It was more than so. And so when you talk about a freedom struggle, you're locating the power of liberation in the hands of the people. But when you reduce it to civil rights, that puts the hand in the power of politicians and the white ruling class in order for liberation. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that we were engaged in a freedom struggle that began the moment of captivity on those waters with the Amistad Rebellion, with the Zoom Rebellion. All of those rebellions were Nat Turner. Those were freedom struggles. The runaway and slave struggle. Those were freedom struggles. Harriet Tubman. All of those struggles took place on Southern soil. And so that young people were separated from understanding that continuity in 1968 when the school system in the South fired 38,000 African American teachers and fired 85% of the Black principals. By doing that, they disconnected Black young people from the story that I've just told you. And no longer were Black adults the cultural carriers of our culture or the decoders of the meaning of the journey. That job became the purview of white teachers. Of course, young people would not understand the story. Of course, they would be disconnected from the story by being in an environment where not only did the white teachers not know the story, but they disregarded the story, period. And so that's very important. So that's one part of the story. But the other part of the story goes back to what Toni Morrison says. Out there, they did not love our children. In those school systems, they did not love our children. The magnificent aspect is that despite all of that, despite all of what they endured in those sites of terror called public schools, our children endured and they survived. And that's the continuity of the Black soul that Du Bois talks about, the resilience. So it's manifested in our children. And in their own way, they have carried forth that resilience. Now we've got to help them locate it in such a way that it becomes redemptive.
You mentioned Du Bois and the souls, of course, the souls of Black folk. And in that, he talked about the tunis and he talked about living behind the veil. And we find ourselves now, they just started, they're now trying to get jurors in the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd. We find ourselves dealing with, again, Breonna Taylor. We still find as the parent of an African American son, I have to have the conversation with my son about how to deal once he gets outside the door. We're still dealing with the tunis. We're still dealing with the veil.
Yes, but once again, we're having a conversation that privileges the impact of whiteness on our lives. And so we're positioning our lives in relationship to whiteness. While that is true, the fundamental question that we must ask ourselves, what have we meant to each other? And what have we made of our lives? If we do not answer that question, we reaffirm that white people are supreme and that they are the masters of the universe and the controllers of our lives. And it's not to deny white racism. It's not to say that racism doesn't exist, but the magnificence of the Black story is our ability to carve out excellence of the arid soil of oppression, enslavement, segregation. It is the vision of an enslaved people who on those sites of terror called plantations sang this song, I've got a right, you've got a right, I've got a right to the tree of life. And it was that right that they perceived that they had that made them become history makers, that made them to refuse to not have a life. And so Black people took segregation and we fertilized the life. And so the question is, what were our aspirations? What did we do? Because if you don't tell that story, then what you're really saying is that everything that we are was created and made by white people, and that we have no agency. And I submit that Black people have an agency. And so while you're talking about George Floyd and the state-sanctioned murder of Black people, at the same time, I think it's really important to talk about the ways in which Black survival persists, the ways in which we are still moving forward, advancing democracy, playing a major role in shaping the very geography of democracy in this country. Otherwise, we are always in the role of victims.
So we
And I'm
need,
saying that to be Black is not only to be a victim, is to be a victor.
so as being a victor, as we have to deal with the reality of education in this country, we need to be talking about holding up and highlighting historically Black colleges and universities. As we are looking at COVID-19 and we are looking at the disparity in healthcare in this country, we also have to be championing the work of so many and the growing number of African American doctors and nurses in this country. There are, as we talk about uh, uh, voter disenfranchisement, we need to
But
also
all of
be.
that still, Wilmer, all of that still begins with the subject of whiteness. What is the subject of Blackness that stands alone outside of whiteness? What are the things in our lives, for
Mhm.
example, that first generation of free African Americans, they were exhilarated with the possibility of freedom. And so they created institutions, they created families, they created relationships, they created fraternal organizations. They created a world. They dreamed a world beyond what white America thought of them. They dreamed the world because of what they thought about themselves. And that's really the subtle difference. They were not just responding to trying to show white America who they were, but they also were trying to live out how they saw themselves and who they thought was their, what they thought was their potential. And that's why they created historically Black colleges, because they believed that they had the capacity to become participants in shaping an intellectual tradition in this country. It was their belief in their innate intelligence. And not only that, but their aspirations to have voice, to speak, to articulate the meanings of Black life is what moved them to want to create a tradition. The intellectual tradition, the desire to belong to each other was the desire to create a family. When that had been, and so I'm saying that it's really important for us to talk about white oppression, but it's also important for us to talk about Black dreams and Black aspirations outside of white oppression.
And you mentioned agency. How do you, through your lectures, how do you, through the Spirit House Project, how do you convey that empowerment that comes with agency?
Okay, I tell the Southern Freedom Movement a different kind of way than what it's told.
Mm-hmm.
I say to people that Black people were the victors and white people were forced, not because they wanted to. White Southerners forced because they were the losers. They were forced to give up the power that they once held. They were forced to negotiate with us. They were forced to rearrange social relationships in the South, not because they wanted to, but because we were the victors. They had their weapons, and we had something, as James Lawson said, that was more powerful than all of their weapons.
The
We
soul
just
force.
celebrated Bloody Sunday. We had soul force. And so, although they beat our bodies on the bridge, they could not contain or destroy our soul force. It was the power of the Black soul force that was the victor, that made us the victors. And so, we never talk about the Southern Freedom Movement as Black people being the victors and that white people were forced, not because they were powerful, they were forced to give up power, not because they wanted to, but because we were powerful. We were more powerful than they were in terms of our spiritual soul force that brought down an empire. And we were so powerful that we brought down this empire without firing a shot. We brought down the Southern Empire without firing a shot. That is soul force. And so that's the way the story needs to be told. And so once we understand that story, then we will not think that we are beggars at somebody else's table. And we'll also understand that the civil rights legislation that came out of the Southern Freedom Movement not only opened up doors for Black folk, but it opened up doors for every American. For example, in the South, before the civil rights legislation, white women did not hold public office. They did not participate in the public sphere. They were relegated to being at home in the private sphere. And so I'm saying And so Jews benefited from the civil rights legislation because prior to that they were tokens. They couldn't live in WASP neighborhoods. Everybody benefited. So Black people reshaped democracy. We were not beggars, we were history makers and shapers of society. That's the way I tell the story.
And so how do we reclaim that narrative? We can also talk about the LGBTQ community and laws that were passed in support of their rights. That came on the shoulders and in the wake of our movement. So how do we reclaim that narrative?
First of all, we reclaim that narrative by understanding, by reframing who were the losers and who were the victors. And we stop seeing ourselves telling the story merely as suffering, but also as victories, achievement, as a soul force, as a powerful people who were so powerful that we stood up against German Shepherd dogs. We stood up against water hoses going at 280 miles an hour. We stood up against cattle prods, and that was the soul force. And so we've got it. First of all, it has to do with how do we see ourselves in the story? Do we see ourselves as large or do we see ourselves as small? And if we were a small, beaten down people, we could not have won that war without any weapons. We could not have made white men see power in the South because you have to understand power, they would not have given up any of that if they had been the winners. And they've spent the last 50 years through all kinds of racist measures trying to regain the territory that we took from them and made them give to us during the Southern Freedom Movement. And the reason why they have taken back the territory is not that they were winners, but that we didn't protect our territories, that we gave the territory away, that we didn't understand that we had been winners and that in peace, if you don't protect the spoils of war, you lose them again.
We have a number of questions that have been submitted, and I know it's a little early, but I'm going to go to the questions now. Anne is asking, what Black organization would you and or I recommend people joining? Your thoughts, Ms. Sales.
I don't want to privilege one organization over the other organization. I think that what we have to do is to develop organizations that deal with the critical questions of what does it mean to live in a capitalist technocracy in the 21st century where very few lives matter and Black lives matter least of all. What does it mean to live in a capitalist technocracy in the 21st century where human labor is being replaced by machines and technology and very few lives matter and we are considered disposable waste in an economic system. So and I would also deal with organizations that begins to lay out a future that answers a question that contests the prediction of the Economic Institute that says that by the year 2053, young Black and brown people will have zero medium income wealth. I would definitely, and I would also suggest that we deal with organizations that have hindsight, insight, and foresight.
Hindsight, insight, and foresight. I agree with you 1,000%. And I would say in my answer to that question, as you just did, I'm not going to recommend one organization over another because I don't know where the individual lives. I don't know what the individual's interests are. I would say seek out those organizations that are speaking to your perception, your needs, your reality. And if it may not necessarily be or have to be an African American organization, if you are in organizations with other African Americans, the question to me becomes, how do you create a source of power within that organization so that even though it's not an African American organization, it still addresses the issues and needs that are important to us? And each individual has to deal with that for themselves. You mentioned the technocracy. You were going to say something, Mama Ruby?
I wanted to say the question is that I would also ask to the question, what is it that we dream of when we imagine freedom? And I
Hmm.
would ask, what do organizations, what are their end goals when they talk about freedom? Are they imagining freedom, the right to imitate and to live just like the people that we're trying to become free from? Or are they imagining a new world of stronger democracy where everybody has the right to the tree of life? So the question for me would be, what is the mission and what is the dream of that organization in
In fact,
terms of freedom?
that takes me to my next point. You were talking about the technocracy. And do you see a problem with materialism, individualism, the lack of appreciation for the importance of the collective? And with the technology and with the technocracy that we find ourselves confronted with, how does that impact our reality as African Americans in 2021?
Well, I think that technocracy accelerates individualism. It decimates real communities and creates the illusion of community through virtual spaces. And community has always been a site of resistance for African Americans. Eye to eye, intimate relationships have been the cornerstone of Black survival and our ability to really thrive in a society that did not intend for us to survive. And so I think that it has had a very adverse effect on the ability of Black people to create viable movements in the 21st century that's rooted in community. The other
And it,
thing that I would say is that in a technocracy, I think that it's really important for us to understand that history is no longer what we make with each other. It is memory is no longer my relationship with you. It's memory is embodied in a community, in a computer. I go to Google and Google has the memory, it has the history. It is the carrier of history. We no longer have conversations with people that transcend time because we no longer read. We go to Google and they become our interpreters of history and of reality. So I think that that really does impact the ability of Black people to formulate a viable struggle in this country. We also are up against social media like TikTok and Instagram, where the value system says that there are losers and there are winners. And the losers are people who are poor, who don't know important people, who can't have exciting pictures where they're standing next to celebrities. And so if you're not involved in the celebrity culture of somebodyness based on materialism, then you are nothing, you're a loser. So those value systems are being created, and those value systems ultimately stand over and against who we are as a people. And finally, this is a very serious question that you've asked, because the Southern Freedom Movement, all movements of Black people in this country, particularly in the South, were spiritual ones. They were not just for material acquisition. They were not just for economic. They were also for redemption, to change, to reconcile our relationships with each other, God, and all aspects of creation. The Southern Freedom Movement was not just a transactional movement, it was a spiritual one that sought to change the Southern landscape and rearrange our relationships. As Martin Luther King said, was a movement towards redemption, to redeem the soul of the South, to remove the burden of enslavement and nullification, not only off of the backs of Black Americans, but also off of the backs of white folk, because he recognized that the culture of whiteness, not white people, but the culture of
culture of
whiteness
whiteness.
is a spiritual disease that deforms and malforms everyone that it touches. And so he was saying that we all needed to be free from the marks of a culture of whiteness. And so that whiteness is not something terrible that happens to Black folk. It's also something that happens to white people because it dehumanizes all of us. And it ruins our potential to live into the goodness in all of us that is eroded out of us by white socialization.
Dr. Shantella asks, do you think that African Americans know themselves today? Have we become vulnerable to the labeling of ourselves individually and collectively as the victimized, quote unquote, subspecies Taney described in Dred Scott?
I don't think it's either or. I think that, yes, we have allowed the culture of whiteness to invade our inner lives in a way that our ancestors did not allow that. And I'm not sure they were any better than we were, but they lived in a segregated society that gave them more room and more of an urgent necessity, they thought, to control their inner lives. What they felt was that they could not control the outer worlds, but they could definitely control their inner lives. And so they sealed off their inner lives, and they did not let the world penetrate them in the ways that we've allowed whiteness to penetrate us. So in many ways, yes. On another level, I think that that resilience that I described that comes from that's embedded in the Black soul force, not because we're better than other people, but it is a resilience born out of necessity. And so I'm saying that, and it's found in young children today. The fact that young children get to public schools that are militarized with police, that decimate their sense of themselves, and that they come out of that not broken winged birds, is a statement that we've not become a thing. It's a statement that life is much more complicated than we're either this or that.
Rita asks, where does our solidarity and unity come from so we can regain what it seems we lost? How do we now move forward with Soul Force in the light of no really unifying organizations and diminishing economic power?
I don't think it has to do with the economic power, because even in the poor South, the essential uh, life-giving force was community. It is in community and our relationship with each other that we come to know our strength and we come to know God. It is in community that we see ourselves reflected back. It is in community that we locate our possibilities. And so I think that the first thing that we need to do is to heal the brokenness that was created between generations with the deliberate attempt of firing 38,000 Black teachers and cleaning Black public schools of Black teachers and inserting things like Teach for America, where young white kids, teachers became the surrogates for the surrogate parents of Black students. So we must build Saturday schools where we are beginning to rebuild intergenerational relationships. Those sites must be healing sites. We must have Saturday schools where young Black kids are coming together and creating folk art, art that is transformative. We must have Saturday schools where we can love up on young African American young folk, as my teachers loved me, so that I don't feel abandoned, so that I don't feel alone, so that they don't feel alienated. We must begin to reclaim each other.
In
That
fact,
is the
that is
first step.
the Saturday school idea. I know Dr. Anthony Montero in Philadelphia has had a wonderful, wonderful Saturday program for a number of years. But this is something that our churches can run with
Yes.
very simply, because in most instances, they have the facilities.
Yes.
What they have to have is the interest, the willingness, and they have to bring in the right individuals to convey the proper message.
We also have the right individuals because we have a generation of retired Black school teachers who
Absolutely.
could come in and serve as a staff. And you don't have to be a school teacher. We have dedicated parents who can come in, dedicated artists who can come in and work with you. What I'm saying is that we have to establish the relationship with each other. You cannot build a movement where there's no cultural continuity. When there's a disruption of the generations, the future cannot be perpetuated. The future is disruptive. So we must create what our ancestors did, where they till generations of young Black people. In 1865, Black men met in Selma, Alabama, and they laid out a community project. And that community project was to educate young Black Southern children to advance the race for the preservation of our rights and liberties. And that became the community project that existed throughout the South for more than 100 years. And they kept on tilling that project, even when there was no evidence that their work was bearing fruit. They kept on. And then came the Jubilee in the 60s. And so that's what we have to do. We have to lay out a collective vision and understand that big victories don't happen overnight, that you have to celebrate and claim the small victories, because there's the small victories that implode into the big ones.
Michael says and then asks, he says, rather than passively accepting things as they are, Black people must embark on the challenge of creating a new reality that ignores or dismisses the microscopic view and judgment of the quote of the all caps white reality in which we operate. Question: what are some methods that exist or can be created in order to help us achieve this all caps new reality?
First of all, once again, we must be careful that we do not make it either or. It is foolhardy to say that we must ignore completely the white impact on our lives. What I'm suggesting is that we must have a simultaneous reality where we not only deal with the impact of whiteness, but we must also deal with the implications of Black dreams and Black aspirations. And we have many, many modalities. So the question is, what modalities do we have that we can draw upon? Education is a modality. Intergenerational relationship is a modality. Culture, the Black culture is a modality. Recreating Black culture that humanizes rather than dehumanizes us. Creating culture that is life affirming, culture that makes us essential in a technocracy that says that we don't matter. So there are many things that we can draw on that already exist, but none of that can happen if we're not willing to read and to really discuss and to analyze and to create programs, discussion groups. You cannot strategize and win the chess game if you don't know the moves.
Reading, discussing, and analyzing is so important, because I find myself, and I know there are friends of mine that find themselves involved in conversations that are really more diatribes, because people are going with the headlines. They're not even reading 3 or 4 paragraphs into the story. They're listening to MSNBC and CNN. They haven't formulated any substantive basis for their own analysis, and so they get carried away. I said small minds get distracted by small things, and so they get carried away by the headline of the moment, and they haven't provided themselves any basis upon which to do any level of substantive analysis.
I'll give you an example that is such an excellent point. For
Oh,
example,
thank you.
if I hear one person again say that we are in a bipartisan dispute, I'm going to scream. The dispute is not bipartisan. The dispute is what has always been the question. The two streams in American society, one stream flowing towards fascism that gave rise to enslavement, that gave rise to genocide of indigenous people, that gave rise to segregation, that gave rise to exploitation, that continues to give rise to anti-Black mob and state-sanctioned violence. And the other stream is a stream that flows towards advancing democracy. These issues have never been resolved. They were not resolved with the Missouri Compromise. They were not resolved with the Three-Fifth Compromise. They were not resolved with Percy versus Ferguson. The issue is still on the table. Will America be a democracy or will it be a fascist state? That is the divide in this country. And so you cannot have democracy with segregation. Segregation is antithetical to democracy. And so that's really the question. And so when we say it's a bipartisan issue, we reduce it to the simple issue of a disagreement between parties, when in fact it's an ideological difference between the very nature of what is the meaning of America and who are considered citizens of America, and to whom does America belong? Is it a white corporate state that belongs to white Americans, or is it a democracy where each of us has the right to participate in building the house of democracy? That's really what's at issue.
If you haven't read, you don't know. You need to read. Okay. Philip asks, could the speakers compare and contrast the difference between reparations and restitution? So many of my white associates feel that the two terms are synonymous. Mama Ruby, your thoughts?
First of all, reparations is not purely a material term. It's not about just giving monies and materialism to repair the harm. Reparations mean that you prepare the structural harms, that you actually have a radical shift in power, so that you democratize America, and you eliminate all of the structure impediments that stand in the way of democracy. And then you set about to restore some of the institutions and the lives of people that you have destroyed. So one requires us to do structural change, and the other one requires us to then, once you've done that, to set about to repair the harm to people's lives. And so I don't think restitution is the same thing as reparations at all. Restitution is really principally a material term that says that what we have to really do is to give brown people the same things that we give white people. And I'm saying that those things are not the expressions of a good life. What is a good life is really at the heart of reparations. And you can give me all the money you want to, but if you continue to structure injustice, by the time I've spent my money, I'm still going to be poor because injustice still exists. And you're just going to get your money back that you've given me because you own all the institutions, all of the stores and everything where my money will be spent, because you have structural advantages.
We have just about 2.5 minutes left. Ibrahim asks, how can we bring the plight of Black political prisoners such as Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, to the African-American consciousness? Is the historical erasure of people like Miss Ruby Sales and Imam Jamil a consequence of the technocracy you mentioned? We can also, there are a number of others beyond Jamil Al-Amin. Your thoughts, Mama Ruby?
Well, I think that we have to remember, to move from dismemory to remembering. And I think that it means that we use our agency, and we begin to be the people who talk, the definers of our lives. And I think that too often, for expediency, we give up our power to name and disclose who we are. And so it goes back to building institutions that are dedicated not only to telling the white story, but also, dedicated to talking about our lives as a people, not only talking about our suffering, but also talking about our achievement, and talking about not only the heroes like a John Lewis, although I think John did a lot of good things. We extract him from the culture, make him the lone hero. You don't have room for anyone else, because he becomes the exceptional Negro that we should celebrate, despite the fact that there were 660 people on that bridge that day who got beaten and who suffered, and some even went to jail afterwards. So we've got to take charge of our narrative. is all I'm saying. And we've got to determine who it is we should be talking about and the conditions about which we will talk about them.
And as we talk about Imam Jamil Al-Amin, we can never forget Mumia Abu Jamal, who is struggling now, I believe, with COVID while he's in prison.
And finally, we must realize that if we're going to talk about political prisoners, we just can't talk about Black men. We have to talk about Assata Shakur. We have to talk about Black women who are also prisoners.
Absolutely.
We must break through the veil of history. If we want to change history, we have to democratize how we talk about history and not just talk about Black men, but also remember, as a young man said, that there's a Ruby Sales in history also, and that we must claim all of the Black bodies and all of the Black lives, as Wilmer Leon does every time I'm on his show. He recognizes that Black women, and especially his mama, that plays a major role in shaping
yes,
Black life.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you, Ms. Ruby Nell Sales. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your love. Thank you for what you do. And I think at this point, it's time for me to turn it back to our hostess.
Thank you.
Regina Taylor.
Thank you so much.
There we go.
Yes, it is a pleasure. I am so happy that you, Mr. Wilmer Leon, and you, Ms. Sales, you are a hero. You are a part of our history, American history. We look up to you, and I'm so happy that this is the first conversation to be had as we're moving forward with the Black Album mixtape. I think is essential to have this conversation in terms of moving forward in this country by looking back at where we came from and trying to figure our future. I'd like to thank all of you for joining this conversation. I'd like to encourage you to join us this next Tuesday, March 16th, for a virtual screening of the Black Album 2020 Resistance, featuring SMU African American students with SMU's Meadow School of the Arts. The initial phase of the Black Album Project Resistance responds to a larger conversation about systemic injustice and its ties to racial identity, addressing and exploring the question of what it is to be Black right here and now. I hope you will join us for this program on the 16th. And if you find yourself inspired by tonight's conversation and this project, consider submitting a piece of original work for adding to the mixtape. Details will be forthcoming via email. We hope to see you at another event soon. Until then, take care and be well. Thank you.
We will stand in the truth, all to gain, nothing to lose. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We will stand on the front line. We will trust in the divine. Oh, we are the children of freedom. We will not move. Oh Lord, freedom comes with the price, and we'll pay. Freedom comes with the price, and we will pay. We are prepared for the fight, even if it costs our lives. Freedom comes with the price, and we'll pay. We are the children of freedom. We will win. We are the children of freedom, and we will win. We will stand in the truth, all to gain, nothing to lose. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We will stand on the front line. We will trust in the divine. Oh, we are the children of freedom. We will not move. Oh Lord, freedom comes with the price, and we'll pay. Freedom comes with the price, and we will pay. We are prepared for the fight, even if it costs our lives. Freedom comes with the price, and we'll pay. We are the children of freedom. We will win. We are the children of freedom, and we will win. We will stand in the truth, all to gain, nothing to lose. We are the children of freedom. We will not move. We are the children of freedom. We will not move.